Hey guys, I'm back with another game review with a game submitted to our Patreon page. And this one was submitted by JoeBog, who's about 1700, playing a fellow player rated around this range. And in this game, we are going to be looking at how to deal with the so-called Gurgenidze system, as far as I understand it, which is basically a combination of black playing a kind of Caro-Kann setup with c6 and d5, along with an early g6. And these positions tend to get quite strategic and quite blocked, and are really not easy for white to handle. So we'll be looking at some typical ideas, and I'll be making some suggestions as far as how to handle this opening. So this game started out with e4, c6, d4, g6, and now white plays knight to c3. Sometimes black plays d5 earlier. I think there's different move orders. Here black plays bishop g7. It's also possible for black to play d5 in this position and get white to commit with the e4 pawn. The way this game starts out is bishop g7, white plays f4, which I think is a very natural move, just gaining space. And now black plays queen to b6, which I think is definitely playable. Once again, black can also play d5 in this position and force white to commit in the center with e5. And I know this is the favorite of many strong blitz players, including Hikaru Nakamura uses this one quite a bit. And so there is some strategic poison to this system, as a lot of times black is playing on the light squares, often trading off this bishop on g4. As soon as white plays knight f3, black just plays bishop g4 and then ends up taking on f3, and then playing this kind of like light square strategy that actually did a couple of videos on this channel about this so-called approach, which to be fair came out of other openings, the Scandinavian and the French. By the way, if you're curious in learning a little bit more about this system, the Gurgenidze system, and a little bit about how to play against it, we did another video on this channel where Grandmaster Sam Shankland, it was like a three-part series. The third part, where he's working with international master David Pruis, focuses on a middle game that David had where he was playing white against the system, and they analyzed a lot of interesting details there as well. So if you want to hear Shankland's take on these positions, I'll link that video in the description below, and you guys can check that out as well. So in this game, black plays queen b6, white goes knight f3. Now black plays d5, and white plays e5. Technically, white could take on d5, and I think this is a kind of pawn sacrifice that black is playing for. There's different moves here, but for example, after knight to h6, it's kind of tricky to handle this position for white. If we take another pawn on c6, then black's second knight comes out, and black is going to get a lot of pressure on the center with moves like bishop g4 and knight f5 coming next. So I like white's approach here to push e5, and we'll come back to this position because I want to share a couple of other ways that white can kind of handle this opening. Another really simple way, I would say, is to play knight f3 in this position, and then after bishop g7 to just play knight c3. And the point of this development scheme is just not to take a ton of space with f4, but to kind of play for, let's say, a somewhat smaller advantage. And after d5, the idea here for white is actually to play h3. So white is not looking to take a lot of space in the opening. Rather, white is playing to restrict black with this early move h3, of course stopping bishop to g4. And here it's kind of a difficult situation for black, because if they develop the knight to f6, then of course they get hit with e5, and the knight doesn't really have a great square to go to. So usually what happens is black takes on e4, and after knight takes e4, black plays knight f6. But now the idea behind the system is for white to take on f6. And now again, black is kind of left in a tough choice, because if they take with the bishop, then they can get hit with bishop h6, and it's awkward for black to castle here and not a very fun position to play. I think the move c3 followed by bishop c4 also gives white a very pleasant game, because I like white's kind of space advantage in the center. Or if black plays e takes f6 because they're trying to avoid the lines with bishop h6, well, then this is just kind of a nice structure for white. And so white can develop here like bishop c4, castle, c3. And again, I think white just has kind of a nice little structural edge here, and certainly white is at least a little bit better. So this is kind of like a simple and safe way, I think, for white to get at least a small advantage if you don't want to go for the big main lines and pushing f4 and playing super ambitiously. But of course, white can play for f4 and definitely play for this big edge here. Now, after f4, queen to b6, there's also other options here for black. I think the way most players play the system is they just go for the immediate d5. And then after e5, a lot of times black throws in this kind of move, h5. And you might see this a lot in your online blitz games. This is typically the way people like to play this position. They carve out some space with h5, taking all the kingside light squares. But still, after knight f3, bishop g4, and h3 takes. I do believe in white's position here. You get the two bishops. And a simple plan would be, for example, to put the bishops on e3 and d3, castle kingside, and let's say black just develops normally. One idea that I think is quite interesting for white is to play knight e2 here, followed by b3. Now this bishop f8 move, this is just one way black plays the position. If they castle too early, they really do have to be careful because they can get hit with g4 or g3, where white gets a lot of play on the king side. If black just kind of tries to play a little bit in the center, then I like this simple expansion on the queen side with b3 followed by c4. And white just starts taking a lot of space, continues improving their position, and in general, I think enjoys a really comfortable position here. So going back to queen to b6, which just puts a little bit of pressure on d4 and forces white to commit the knight to f3. I think Joe plays the opening well, but there's a very specific moment where I think we can improve white's play. So bishop g4, bishop e2, and here black plays knight h6, which is a pretty typical move. And I would say here white kind of plays into black's hands with the move h3. After this move, black is able to take on f3, white recaptures, plays knight f5 to attack the pawn on d4, and white is forced to play knight e2 to defend this pawn, where I think had black played the move h5 here, black would basically get everything that they're looking for out of this opening. The knight is really solid on f5, black can play e6 next, and then knight to d7, just has a really, really solid position, and it's not clear what white's plan should be. Instead, what I would recommend for white is not to play this move h3, at least not right away, but actually follow the plan that most strong players seem to choose, which involves a quick knight to a4, either right away or after, let's say, castling knight f5 and now knight a4. And the idea behind this move knight a4, let's look at the immediate knight a4 here, is to open up the c-pawn to be able to come to c3, strengthen white's center, and then the knight on a4 can transfer back to the center, either through the c5 square and then to d3, or in many cases, white plays c3 and even b4 here, and then brings the knight from b2 over to d3, and then reinforces the center. And if white can successfully defend the center, I think white just gets a big advantage because you get a lot of space and your pieces have a lot of room to maneuver. Whereas black is going to start feeling very cramped, and they're going to feel like they don't really have a lot of counterplay, especially if white gets this b4 clamp on the position. So there's actually a really well-played model game in this position between two Armenian grandmasters, Sahakian playing as white against Petrosian playing as black. And that game continued knight a4, queen a5 check, white plays c3, knight d7, b4, so white just continues the plan, pushes the queen back. And then this key move knight to g5, which I think is pretty instructive because it feels like white shouldn't really want to trade the light square bishops, but even after the trade of bishops, I would say that white just has a big advantage here due to the advantage in space, and black never really gets any significant counterplay in this game. So I'll just show a couple more moves how things progress. Black played e6, white castled, castles, rook b1, rook e8, knight comes back to f3, f6, kind of executing the typical, French-like break. And here white just plays bishop to d2. And white's point is that if black plays fe5, white's just going to recapture with the f-pawn, and pretty much all of black's pieces are restricted here. The bishop on g7 is very restricted, the knight on d7 is quite bad, queen is very passive. Black basically has one good piece in the position, the rook on f8. Black can also play knight to f5 and put the knight on a seemingly good square, but this knight doesn't really attack anything because the pawn on d4 is so well defended. So white can continue with something like knight to b2, followed by bringing the knight to d3, eventually advancing on the queen side, pushing a4, for example. And one day, if white really wants to, they can always kick the knight with some kind of g4 move. And basically black is just kind of sitting and waiting for white to expand here. With no real counterplay, I think black's position is really suspect. And white ended up winning a very nice game after b6, knight b2, queen c8, a4. Black played this kind of freeing move c5, and white simply pushes past with b5, which I thought was quite interesting, as after c takes d4, c takes d4, white was able to soon take over the c file with rook c1 and queen d3, and yeah, eventually was able to win a very nice technical game. So definitely look that game up if you want to play through the whole thing. Once again, that was Sahakian against Petrosian. And yeah, I really like this plan and this kind of position of bringing the knight to a4, clamping down on the c5 square, and then following up with c3, b4. So I would definitely recommend utilizing this idea next time you find yourself in this kind of position. In the game, white ended up playing h3, and like I mentioned, after takes, knight f5, white was forced to go back with knight e2, and now had black played h5, I think black would have just achieved dream position. Instead, black played a5, which kind of gave white the chance to play bishop g4 here. Somewhat of an unusual idea, but it makes sense. White just wants to take this knight on f5 and get rid of black's best piece. And then again, I would say white has an edge, as white just has a lot of space and black's position would be kind of passive. But instead we had c3, h5, white tried g4, knight h4, knight g3 to defend the bishop. And I would say black ended up getting really good counterplay in the position, and actually in a couple of moves, white ends up in some deep trouble. So takes, knight g2 check, king f2, knight comes back to h4, and here white blunders with f5, forgetting about this pin along the diagonal, and after bishop takes e5, black was already just completely winning here, winning a very important central pawn, and basically freeing all of black's pieces. Now black's position comes to life, and yeah, white wasn't really able to create any chances after this. It was pretty much busted. And this is the advantage of playing these types of systems as black, is that the opponent is not really familiar with how to react and how to use the space advantage. You know, these kinds of accidents happen all the time where the side that's fighting against the space advantage is able to break through and create counterplay, and then things can collapse for white very, very quickly. So black ended up winning a nice game. So all right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you found it instructive. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please make sure to do so. We really do appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.